I'm very happy to say that I'm ready to introduce Sam Agbamu, and we're going to hear from him for his keynote. So, Sam is an assistant professor in classics at the University of Reading in the UK, which is in a slightly different time relationship with the US right now, as we found out today, where he teaches Latin, Roman history, and a module on race in antiquity. Sam is the author of 2024's Restorations of Empire in Africa, which examines modern Italy's uses of Roman history in support of its colonial endeavors in Africa. His second book, Petrarch's Africa and Its Afterlives, is out in May this year. The book homes in on Petrarch's 14th century Latin epic about the Second Punic War to suggest that it was a pivotal text for reshaping ideas of race and empire for an early modern context. Sam is finishing a book for general readers about how the dual ideologies of classicisms and crusades shaped the idea of the white Western world. And additional research interests include the Trinidadian Marxist intellectual C.L.R. James's engagement with antiquity, the contemporary artist William Kentridge, as well as a nascent research project on eco-critical readings of post-classical Latin epic. And also, I should say, I think I have some students in my classics and race class who were very thrilled to read Sam's commentary on the Petrarch's Africa part of the recent reader that ccame out, edited by Sarah Derbo et al. And so please join me in welcoming Sam, whose keynote is entitled The Battle for Births, Rethinking the Birth of Biopolitics. Take it away, Sam.
Thanks again for your flexibility and patience as I work out that we are not, in fact, 9 hours ahead of Pacific time, but 8 hours for a couple of weeks. So as a brief note, my paper involves themes of racism, misogyny, as well as racist violence and murder. And in keeping with the material that I will be engaging with, I'll be referring to people who are able to give birth as women. And this is simply because of the material that I'm dealing with. So to begin, on the 30th of January 2018, an Australian man living in New Zealand uploaded his political manifesto. It began, "It's the birth rates, it's the birth rates, it's the birth rates. If there's one thing I want you to remember from these writings, it's that the birth rates must change. Even if we were to deport all non-Europeans from our lands tomorrow, the European people would still be spiraling into decay and eventual death. Every day we become fewer in number. We grow older, we grow weaker. In the end, we must return to replacement fertility levels, or it will kill us. To maintain the population, the people must achieve a birth rate that reaches replacement fertility levels. In the Western world, this is roughly 2.06 births per woman." Entitled The Great Replacement, the manifesto argues that white women needed to reproduce at a rate far above what it is. The individual goes on to allege that there is not a single Western country, not a single white nation in which white women biologically reproduce at the rate that the individual deems necessary. Not in Europe, not in the Americas, not in Australia or New Zealand, the individual alleges. Yet, despite falling birth rates among white populations in Europe, the Americas, Australia, and New Zealand, the populations in these countries were increasing. How, this individual asks, is this possible? And then he gives his answer. Mass immigration and high fertility levels, rates of the immigrants themselves, are causing the increase in population. Millions of people pouring across our borders, legally invited by the state and corporate entities to replace the white people who have failed to reproduce, failed to create the cheap labor, new consumers, and tax base that the corporations and states need to thrive. Soon after this, the individual comes to the crux of the matter. This is ethnic replacement. This is cultural replacement. This is racial replacement. This is, and then in caps lock, white genocide. What, from his perspective, is the individual to do about this? Europe, the Australian individual in New Zealand alleges, is for Europeans. He writes that the invaders must be removed from European soil regardless from where they came or when they came. Roma, African, Indian, Turkish, Semitic, or other. If they are not of our people, but live in our lands, they must be removed. Only in this way could white genocide be reversed. Only in this way could the individual achieve the aim expressed in the final words of his manifesto, Europa rises. The individual's obsession with birth rates and population sizes reflects a morbid and violent biopolitical commitment. The term biopolitics was coined by the Swedish political scientist Rudolf Kjellén in his 1916 book, The State as Life Form. In this, the biopolitical is summarized as a form of politics which relates to human life, as opposed to geopolitics, which is about land and territory. Biopolitics is, however, of course, a concept much more closely related to Michel Foucault. It appears briefly at the end of the first volume of his History of Sexuality, but is elaborated more fully in a series of lectures that he gave in the Collège de France in the mid to late 1970s. Simply put, biopolitics expresses the means by which governmental biopower is produced by and operates through the management of human life. Of course, human life has always been central to politics, but from Foucault's perspective, human life became a truly central preoccupation of political techniques during the 18th century. At this time, an effort was made by political theorists and policymakers to rationalize the biological phenomena of human society, such as health, hygiene, birth rate, life expectancy, race, etc. Biopolitics expresses, in other words, how, starting from the 18th century, modern Western societies took on board the fundamental biological fact that human beings are a species. It's also in this period, Foucault reasons, that race begins to be thought of in biological terms, and that the notion of racial purity starts to emerge. Discourses of race and biological thinking, therefore, go hand in hand and contribute to the articulation of the flip side of biopolitics. Biopower determines not only who must live, but who must also die. We must have this latter aspect, termed necropolitics by Achille Mbembe, in mind when we consider what Sophia Siddiqui calls reproductive racism. Siddiqui writes that we need a framework to understand how, in different countries and political contexts of Europe, native women's reproductive capacities are being incentivized for nationalist ends, and how those same rights to have children and family life for minority migrant women are being restricted, whilst the hyper-exploitation of their labor is simultaneously essential to care for the young, sick and elderly of the nation under advanced capitalism. Siddiqui goes on to write how the birth rate agenda rests on the premise that the future of the nation relies on the continuous growth, often hinging on the perceived threat of a demographic war between native Europeans and immigrants, especially Muslims. Indeed, the individual who wrote the manifesto with which I started this presentation is obsessed with the idea that Christians in Europe were being replaced with Muslims. But thinking like his does not always target Muslims. For example, in the summer of 2017, white supremacists and neo-Nazis marched through Charlottesville in Virginia, chanting, "Jews will not replace us." Relatedly, neo-Nazi terrorists murdered Jewish worshippers at synagogues in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and Poway in California in 2018 and 2019, blaming Jewish people for what they thought of, or what they term, the genocide of white Europeans. Shortly after the individual whose manifesto I mentioned earlier uploaded his manifesto, he entered a mosque in New Zealand in the city of Christchurch during Friday prayers. Armed with automatic weapons on which he had written the names and dates of battles between Christian and Muslim forces, as well as neo-Nazi symbols and slogans, he opened fire on the worshippers. From the mosque, he drove to a Muslim cultural center and repeated his murderous spree. In total, he killed 51 people. This was the necropolitics of reproductive racism in action. Since 2019, the Christchurch terrorist thinking has become increasingly mainstream. Christian nationalism, obsessions with birth rates, Islamophobia, anti-Semitism, and anti-immigration politics have coalesced in a way that they have not before. On the 13th of September 2025, London saw the biggest far-right demonstration in decades, if not ever. Upwards of 100,000 people flooded my city with Union Jacks and St. George's flags to hear the likes of the far-right French politician Eric Zemmour warn that, and I quote, "the great replacement of our European people by peoples coming from the South and of Muslim culture threatens to eradicate white Europeans." He went on to say, and I quote, "You and we are being colonized by our former colonies." But perhaps most troubling of all is the fact that the world's richest man and one of the world's most powerful addressed the crowd via video link, telling them from giant screens that whether you choose violence or not, violence is coming to you. You either fight back or you die. Musk is obsessed with declining birth rates. He thinks it's the most pressing threat to humanity, and he's not the only one. In 2025, during his first address as the Vice President of the United States of America, J.D. Vance announced, and I quote, "I want more babies in the United States," end quote. Soon afterwards, Donald Trump signed an executive order to support in vitro fertilization, also recognizing, and again I quote, "the importance of family formation and that our nation's public policy must make it easier for loving and longing mothers and fathers to have children," end quote. Of course, this president, whose regime kidnaps, deports, and separates families, is not talking about all loving and longing mothers and fathers. Meanwhile, in my national context, Nigel Farage's Reform UK have been amplifying anxieties about declining birth rates and disintegrating traditional family values. Matthew Goodwin, the recently and thankfully defeated Reform UK candidate for the by-election in Gorton and Denton, a suburb of Manchester, called for what he referred to as a negative child benefit tax for women who, and I quote, "don't have offspring," end quote. Conversely, he proposed removing income tax for women who have had 2 or more children. He calls for young girls to be given what he refers to as a biological reality check, and nods along on Jordan Peterson's podcast as the psychologist decries the destruction of higher education and the family through the admittance of too many women to university. Such fear-mongering about women going to university rather than reproducing is nothing new. In a 1902 letter, Theodore Roosevelt referred to white middle-class women going to university rather than focusing on raising children as race suicide. At the same time as all of Goodwin's pro-natalist hot air, his party proposes to reimpose the 2-child benefit cap, which has only just been lifted. Forget about pursuing higher education, have more children, and at a younger age seems to be Reform UK's message to UK women, but don't expect too much help from the state. But this isn't about all UK women, of course, and nor in fact is this about maintaining stable population levels in this country. It's Reform's policy to strip those with indefinite leave to remain of their right to stay in the country. And lest we mistake this for a matter of citizenship, more than half of Reform UK supporters think that non-white foreign-born British citizens should be deported, and more than a fifth think that even those who are born here should go. Unlucky for me. Birth rates across the world are close to being in decline, but more so in some countries than others. For populations to remain stable, they need to have a replacement rate of 2.1. In other words, every mother needs to have 2.1 children. Currently, the global birth rate is 2.2, compared with 4.9 in the 1950s, but this is set to drop below 2.1 by 2050. Some countries fall far below the global average. The United States, for example, has a birth rate of 1.6, Italy has a birth rate of 1.5, and South Korea, the world's lowest, has one of 0.75. A lower birth rate brings problems of aging populations and shortages of labour. There are 2 key aspects to note. First, that the world population is at a record high. Humanity is not on the verge of disappearing, at least not because of the decline of the traditional family. Second, the problems that accompany declining birth rates in lower fertility countries could be mitigated by immigration from higher fertility countries. Yet, as a 2024 article in the medical journal The Lancet warned, this approach will only work if there is a shift in current public and political attitudes towards immigration in many lower fertility countries. Why then are pro-natalist politics so often accompanied by anti-immigrant reproductive racism? As well as holding an obsession with birth rates, Musk is, as we know, obsessed with ancient Rome. In the 2024 interview, he frames his concern about birth rates with reference to the empire that he claims to think about every day. I'm not going to bore you by quoting Musk at length, but I do want to draw out the fact that he refers to Caesar's and Julius Caesar's and Augustus's attempts to incentivize childbirth, concluding that, and I quote, "Rome fell because the Romans stopped making Romans," and many ancient historians were quick to point out this dangerous oversimplification. He repeated these ideas at a rally in Philadelphia in the October of 2024, pointing this time to high birth rates during the Punic Wars, which however plummeted after the destruction of Carthage. Musk stands in a tradition of using ancient Rome as a political model, especially in relation to ideas of decline and how to avoid the same perceived causes of civilizational collapse. Now, the paper that I'm presenting today represents a part of a broader nascent project which traces pro-natalist discourses from antiquity to today. My approach is indebted to Marxist feminism, which reminds us of the unremunerated labor which supports biological reproduction, as well as to challenge us to think beyond the structures of the nuclear family, a structure which was identified even as long ago as Engels' work on the origins of the family as a means of protecting private property and of building the nation state. In this particular paper, I'll be homing in on the ancient Roman context, not only to suggest that biopolitics was born much earlier than Foucault suggests, which I don't think is that significant a claim, but that we can detect traces of the ancient roots of Siddiqui's reproductive racism, which, although was not born in Rome, is nonetheless present. I'll be suggesting that when ancient Romans and political figures today talk about birth rates, increasing populations is rarely what it's about. Now, Rome was not built in a day, and nor did its population swell to its ancient peak of about 1 million overnight. Nevertheless, if we believe our historiographical sources, from the foundation of the city, its leaders were concerned with enlarging the population of the city. According to Dionysius of Halicarnassus, writing under Augustus, Romulus increased the population of the city by making it mandatory for parents to raise all of the male children they might have, as well as their firstborn daughters. No child under 3 years old might be destroyed by their parents unless, and here we encounter a eugenicist loophole, the children are severely disabled. In these cases, their murder might be sanctioned with the approval of 5 neighbours. In this respect, we are reminded of the eugenicist elements of Plato's Republic and Aristotle's Politics. According to Cicero, the 12 Tables legislated for the destruction of severely disabled children. We get further hints of pronatalist policies later on in Dionysius. At the Battle of Cromera in 447 BCE, fought between Rome and Veii, 306 men of the gens Fabia were purportedly killed. We read of this in Livy, Book 2, according to whom only one adolescent male of the Fabii were left. Dionysius expresses his dismay at this suggestion, saying that the notion that there was only one male survivor of the entire clan is not only improbable, but impossible. It was surely not the case, Dionysius says, that all of the Fabii who went out to fight Veii were unmarried and childless. After all, the law of the Romans required all of a certain age to marry and obliged them to rear their children. Surely, Dionysius reasons, so upstanding a gens as the Fabii were not in violation of this law. The idea that the purpose of marriage was procreation is conveyed in an anecdote related by Gellius, which is drawn in turn from Servius Sulpicius's De Dotipus about Spurius Carvilius Ruger's 231 BCE divorce. Carvilius loved his wife dearly. She was, however, unable to have children, and so Carvilius, forced by the oath he had made to the censors, divorced her. The oath made to the censors was that one would marry for the purpose of having children. The censors were positioned as the moral guardians of Rome, and we should view their role of overseeing the lustral census as part of their moral responsibility. Populations required procreation, and the procreation of the population was firmly within the remit of the censors. When one thinks of the office of the censor, Cato the Elder is never far from one's mind. Plutarch gives us an idea about the duties of the censor when he comes to explain the powers held in that office by Cato. Plutarch writes that, and I quote, "The variety of its powers was great, including that of examining into the lives and manners of its citizens. Its creators thought that no one should be left to his own devices and desires without inspection and review, either in his marriage, or in the begetting of his children, or in the ordering of his daily life, or in the entertainment of his friends. No, rather thinking that these things revealed a man's real character, more than did his public and political career, they set men in office to watch, admonish, and chastise, that no one should turn aside to wantonness and forsake his native and customary mode of life. Woe betide anyone who might make a mockery of the censor's power to peer into the marital chamber." To return to Gellius, we hear of a man who, when asked by the censors whether he had a wife, replied that he did indeed, but not one that he could desire. As punishment for making light of the censor's interest in what goes on in the privacy of one's own bedroom, this man was reduced to the status of an aerarius. As well as encouraging marriage for the purpose of procreation, censors also disincentivize celibacy. Cicero even goes so far as to suggesting in his laws that the censors banned celibacy altogether. In fact, the censors for 403 BCE, Camillus and Postumius imposed fines for men who remained unmarried. Valerius Maximus has them explain their law in the following way. Nature has blessed these unmarried men with life, and their parents had done them the good service of bringing them up to maturity. These bachelors therefore owe it to nature and to their parents and to posterity to reproduce. In his Life of Camillus, Plutarch explains these censors' rationale for their injunction, namely to increase the taxable population of Rome, the need for which was all the more acute in light of the long wars against Veii. In the latter part of the 2nd century BCE, a censor gave a speech, De Prole Algenda, about the importance of marriage for procreation. Gellius says it was Metellus Numidicus, censor in 102 BCE, Livy that it was Metellus Macedonicus who was censor in 131 BCE. The significance of this speech in Livy is that Livy and Suetonius have Augustus refer to this speech in his justification for his own pronatalist laws. With regard to the demographic context of Metellus Macedonicus's day, Peter Brunt shows that between 163 and 135 BCE, there was a 6% decline in the number of citizens. Was this then the reason behind the speech? The speech is transmitted in Gellius. It attracted commentary in Metellus' suggestion that marriage is a burden for men, but nature obliges them to marry for the sake of what he refers to as perpetual health, rather than brief pleasure. Some ancient commentators found his negative characterization of marriage to be unhelpful. The job of a censor is to encourage marriage, not to put people off it. But Titus Castricius thought that Metellus' honesty makes its overarching message clearer, namely that without numerous marriages, a state cannot survive. Macedonicus practiced what he preached. He died leaving 6 children and 11 grandchildren. Caesar, as Mosk notes, was notably interested in promoting increased birth rates. In his Pro Marcello, Cicero urges Caesar to see to the moral regeneration and revitalize birth rates, propaganda soboles, of Rome, following the tumult of civil war. How does Cicero suggest that he does this? By binding people together with severe laws, but what would these severe laws entail? In actuality, Caesar chose the carrot over the stick and rewarded procreation by distributing land in Campania among 20,000 families who'd had 3 children or more. And we hear about this in Suetonius and in Cassius Dio. Dio, writing under the Severans, gives the deaths caused by the civil wars as the reason for the incentivization of procreation. Suetonius, however, purportedly using the account of Marcus Actorius Naso, apparently well versed in the private life of Caesar, characteristically and salaciously suggests that Caesar tried to use the law to legitimize his own sex life. Enumerating his numerous dalliances with Eunoe, for example, or Cleopatra, Caesar allegedly pressured Helvius Cinna, tribune of the plebs, to pass a law which would allow Caesar to marry as many times as he wanted, and whom he wanted, and marry as many times as he wanted and whom he wanted for the sake of procreation, echoing the legalistic language of Liberarum Quaerandorum Causa. Here we start to see aspects of pronatalist laws being used by the powerful as a cover for the hypocrisy of their own private lives. And then, of course, we come to Augustus. Not long after his victory at Actium, Augustus tried to pass a law which would penalize celibacy. It's not clear whether the law had simply been proposed or promulgated before it was soon repealed or the proposal was withdrawn. Our main source for this event is Propertius' Elegy 2.7, in which the poet celebrates the laws being repealed, since it would have made his affair with Cynthia more difficult. How you must have rejoiced, Cynthia, at the repeal of that law, Propertius writes. We get a sense from Propertius that the ostensible reason for this law was the production of male children to ultimately serve in Augustus's legions. But no blood of mine will ever be a soldier, the irreverent Propertius proclaims. Propertius's poem gives the obvious impression that childbirth was encouraged to keep up the supply of manpower for the legions. In 18 and 17 BCE, Augustus passed laws related to marriage and adultery, the Lex Julia de Maritandis Ordinibus and the Lex Julia de Adulteriis. These are the laws celebrated by Horace in his Carmen Saeculare in his invocation to Diana. Horace, it must be noted, never married nor did he have children. Ancient commentators frequently do not make a distinction between the provisions of these laws and those of the later Lex Papia Poppaea, promulgated in the year 9. Furthermore, there is a disagreement among scholars as to whether the Lex Papia Poppaea represented a reinforcement or a relaxation of the previous laws. Nevertheless, the overarching effects of both of these laws was that it was incumbent upon all Roman adults to be married. For men, the liable ages were 25 to 60, and for women, 20 and 50. Those who'd been divorced or widowed were expected to remarry if they were within these ages. Although freeborn people who'd already raised 3 children were exempt from this obligation to remarry, this number rising to 4 children for freed people. Based on Gaius's institutions, it seems that under this legislation, Orbi, i.e. The married but childless people, should lose half of any inheritance they might receive. Moreover, they would only be entitled to leave 1/10 of their inheritance to their spouses. But what, and here we come to the crux of things, was the purpose of Augustus's pro-natalist laws? Peter Brunt suggests that between 225 BCE and the reign of Augustus, the population of Italy had increased by 2 million, from 5 million to 7 million. However, Brunt argues that this increase was mostly made up of the enslaved population, suggesting that the number of free people may actually have decreased in this same period. In Brunt's opinion, the free population of Republican Rome was simply not able to reproduce itself, in which case it might seem reasonable to take the laws for their word. Slavery was not, as we know, racialized in the same way in Roman antiquity as it was in Western modernity, but nonetheless, we do see here a prefiguration of the Christchurch terrorists' emphasis on declining birth rates of white people, even when national birth rates are rising in some Western countries. The challenge for Augustus was not declining birth rates, but declining birth rates among some strata of Roman society. If we take the Res Gestae at its word, which of course we do not, Augustus celebrates the population growth during his rule and seemingly attributes this to the laws that he had passed. In 28 BCE, Augustus took a census for the first time in 41 years. At this point, the population was 4,063,000 citizens. Another was taken in 8 BCE, returning 4,233,000 citizens. Sorry, 4,233,000 citizens. And another in the year 14, a few months before Augustus' death, giving 4,937,000 citizens. Now, I don't want to get too bogged down in the high count, low count debate for now. Nevertheless, Augustus ends this section of his Res Gestae with the words, "By the passage of new laws, I restored many traditions of our ancestors which were then falling into disuse, and I myself set precedents in many things for posterity to imitate." Clearly, on the one hand, Augustus views his laws as contributing to the increased population, but the emphasis on restoring tradition should not pass unnoticed. Velleius Paterculus presents the legal reforms of Augustus in a utopian light. He writes, "Agriculture retained the fields, respect to religion, to mankind, freedom from anxiety, and to each citizen his property rights were now assured. Old laws were usefully amended, and new laws passed for the general good." Again, we have the emphasis on the restoration of laws, but now also new laws are highlighted. We see further hints of Augustus' orientation towards the past in Augustus' evocation of Metellus Macedonicus' speech, De Prole Algenda. Although the marriage laws are not explicitly mentioned in this passage, we can assume that they are included among the new laws mentioned here. Agriculture returning to the fields might be read as a comment on agricultural fertility corresponding to a fertile population. A similar idea is expressed in the Tellus, Venus, or Italia, or even Ceres relief of the Areopagus, however you choose to identify this figure. Tacitus gives us a negative impression of Augustus' marriage laws, especially the Lex Papia Poppaea, which he presents as a tightening of pre-existing legislation. Under this law, Tacitus says that guards were placed over the population, incited by the opportunity to collect fines. The state is positioned as a parent to all, and as a parent will step into the role of any who abnegate their responsibility and take on the inheritance that the Orbi and the Caelebes, the celibate people, no longer deserve. Tacitus says the activity of these custodes penetrated deeply, autis penetrabant. It's hard not to read phallocentric imagery into the representation of these policemen of procreation. Every city of Italy suffers from this activity, and terror threatens all. These laws were, of course, a form of social control, but their aims of penetrating into the most private sphere speak to the totalitarian ambitions of the Augustan regime. These laws were not just or were not even about birth rates, but, judging by Tacitus's narrative, about control and the accumulation of state funds. The laws were also a reflection and deflection of Augustus's private life. Suetonius tells us that Augustus put his grandchildren on show to emphasize his own commitment to his pronatalist laws. But by the time the Lex Papia Poppaea was promulgated in the year 9, Augustus was no longer the apparently successful paterfamilias that he was in 18 BCE. Gaius and Lucius were dead, and Julia was on a prison island, and the adopted Tiberius was now heir. It's for this reason that this disjuncture between the private life of Augustus and public law may account for a long speech that the 3rd century Cassius Dio gives to Augustus on the occasion of the promotion of the Lex Papia Poppaea. The speech begins when protesters have gathered in the forum to protest Augustus's marriage laws. We can assume that this is the Lex Julia. Augustus then divides the protesters into two groups, those who are bachelors on the one hand and those who are married on the other. The former group predictably outnumbers the latter, and Augustus rebukes the former while praising the latter. Adam Camesis wonders why Dio's treatment of the Lex Julia is so much less full than the Papia Poppaea, especially since the Lex Julia is so much is generally seen as more significant in earlier Roman historiography. It's likely, based on Manivald's study of Dio's sources, that Dio used different material for 18 BCE than he did for the year 9. Due to the paucity of the annalistic tradition for the later years of Augustus's reign, it's likely that Dio cobbled his account together from a range of sources, although this is not a universally held view. But rather than the difference in Dio's treatment between the passing of the Lex Julia and the Lex Papia Poppaea being a matter of different source material, it's instead a matter of narrative irony and Dio's comment on his Severan present. Septimius gave great prominence to his family in official ceremonial, and even after the messy succession and unpopularity of Caracalla, the dynasty maintained its grip on power with the prestige of the family name. In a move away from the precedent set under the Antonines, for whom succession ran into the extended family, Severan succession was directly hereditary. For Dio's history, family relationships matter a lot, and this is reflected in the weight that he gives to the passing of the Lex Papia Poppaea. If perceptions of the significance of Augustus's marriage laws depended on the eye of the beholder, then hindsight about the fate of Julia naturally colours how we view things. In fact, Leo Raditza suggests that we might even see the marriage laws as an expression of a generational clash. The post-Actium generation, spoilt by the Pax Augusta, needs to be brought to heel and the Mos Maiorum restored. We might see the contrasting views of the different generations in the divergent perspectives of Horace and Propertius vis-à-vis the marriage laws. Brunt suggests that in Augustus' day, celibacy may indeed have been common among the upper classes. But, as Brunt characteristically clarifies, such evidence tells us nothing about the poor. Brunt draws parallels between the state of things in the 2nd century BCE and the 20th century. He writes that it's extremely unlikely that the people whom Tiberius Gracchus described as homeless wanderers, the people who depended on daily wages they could earn in harvesting or seasonal work in the Roman docks, behaved differently from the lowest paid workers in St. Petersburg in 1911. Elsewhere, Brunt clarifies how income relates to childbearing in 1911 St. Petersburg. Among industrial workers at St. Petersburg, earning on an average of 472 rubles a year, 90% of those earning below 400 rubles lived alone, and only those earning above 600 rubles tended to have families with children. One must also recall that the grain dole at Rome was at that time only distributed to men and was certainly not sufficient to support a family. If people are prevented from having children due to their economic position, then surely a more effective way to promote increased childbirths would be to improve the financial situation of the general population, rather than to penalise childlessness and for the state to reap the benefits of such penalties. This is, as Andrew Wallace Hadrill spots, a point also made in a French study of 1895 on the Augustan demographic laws. We cannot seriously believe, Wallace Hadrill suggests, that Augustus believed that his demographic laws would be effective in increasing the Roman population any more than it would have increased anyway. This is also the tact taken by Trajan. Augustus's demographic laws were deeply hated and repealed, or at least loosened, by Tiberius. Trajan takes a different approach from the first emperor. This emperor instituted what amounted to childcare benefits, an allowance distributed to parents for raising children. Pliny links these alimenta, these distribution of child benefits, to military strength in his panegyric to Trajan. We also have coins commemorating the distribution of these alimenta. Pliny takes pleasure in thinking that he contributes to the funds for these child benefits. In one of his letters, he writes, and I quote, "I had also to consider the fact that in addition, I was not paying for public games or a show of gladiators, but making an annual contribution towards the maintenance of freeborn children," end quote. So far I've been suggesting that Roman and especially Augustan pronatalist laws were motivated by the desire for social control, an appeal to tradition in order to keep younger generations in check, and for the accumulation of capital in state coffers, which were not, under Augustus, dispersed to make childbearing more attractive. In addition, I suggest that Roman, and again especially Augustan pronatalism, was motivated by a sort of proto-nationalism or even a reproductive racism. If increasing the population were the aim of the laws, then one might assume that bringing outsiders into the Roman population would be desirable. However, two Augustan laws, the Lex Fufiae Canina from the year 2 BCE and the Lex Aelia Sentia from the year 4, limited entry to Roman citizenship for formerly enslaved people, and placed restrictions on marriage between freed women and their former enslavers. And even if slavery were not racialized in quite the same way in Roman antiquity as in modernity, race remains an unavoidable consideration in discussions of ancient slavery. We get a hint of Augustan reproductive racism in Suetonius's characterization of the limits that Augustus placed on manumission. Suetonius writes, and I quote, considering it also of great importance to keep the people pure and unsullied by any taint of foreign or servile blood, he was most chary of conferring Roman citizenship and set a limit to manumission. When Livia asks that Roman citizenship be granted to a Gaul, Augustus refused, but offered the compromise of relieving this Gaul from the obligation to pay tribute, saying that he would rather lose money than prostitute Roman citizenship. Relatedly, in the long speech that Dio gives Augustus on the passing of the Lex Papia Poppaea, one of the reasons that Augustus gives for the passing of the law is that, and I quote Dio here, "It's neither right nor credible that our race, our genos, should cease, and the name of Romans be blotted out with us, and the city be given over to foreigners, Greeks, or even barbarians." For Dio, of old Roman senatorial and Greek descent, and writing under the Severans and in the context of the Edict of Caracalla of 212 CE, one motivation for Augustan pronatalism was the fear of Romans being replaced by foreigners. Further indication of Augustus's Roman chauvinism are to be found, for example, in his insistence that people wear toga in the Forum, and this is in Suetonius, and the fact that foreigners were expelled from the city of Rome at times of scarcity. In sum, pronatalist laws in the Roman Republic and Empire were only secondarily about birth rates. Rather, they were about money, social control, and racism. Richard Frank and Ronald Syme a long time ago characterized Augustus's demographic policies as archaizing. Syme put it this way, and I quote, "The new state of Augustus glorified the strong and stubborn peasant of Italy, laboriously winning from the cultivation of cereals a meager subsistence for himself and for numerous virile offspring." Syme goes so far as to call Augustus's demographic policies perverse anachronisms, and, as Frank suggests, it was with such backwards-looking policy-making that Ovid wrote, "Let others praise the good old days. I'm glad to be alive now. This age suits me, for we have culture." So, moving towards a conclusion, In his 2018 book, Civis Romanus Sum, the Italian education minister and expert in Roman law, Giuseppe Valditara, positioned Augustus' birth rate policies in relation to a desire to protect what Valditara called a Roman identity. Valditara argues that no mass naturalizations of foreigners happened during Augustus's reign. His aim was to promote Romanization and the assimilation of conquered people by increasing the original Roman population and protecting Roman identity and values. End quote. What, it must be asked, does Valditara mean by the original Roman population? Tellingly, the next chapter of Valditara's book is on Roman walls as a point of origin for Roman identity, beginning with Romulus's wall and referring to the Aurelian walls of Rome as the city's greatest monument. Next, Valditara explains the concept of mos maiorum as an underpinning of Roman identity before ending his book by expounding on the importance of the concept of Roman identity encapsulated by the phrase Civis Romanus Sum. Someone else expounded on this declaration of Roman identity, best known from Cicero's In Verum. This person writes, or said, Rome is our point of departure and our point of reference. It is our symbol and, if you like, our myth. We dream of a Roman Italy, that is, an Italy wise and strong, disciplined and imperial. Much of the immortal spirit of Rome is reborn in fascism. The Fasces are Roman, our combat organization is Roman, our pride and courage are Roman. Civis Romanus Sum. This someone else, who is of course Benito Mussolini, delivered a speech in 1927 to promote a pro-natalist agenda. In this speech, Mussolini enumerates the risks posed to the health of the Italian race and outlines the measures that his regime had taken to address them. He advocates attention to maternity and infancy and new institutions created for their interests. These interests needed funding, and Mussolini, like his Roman models, levies a tax on bachelors, which would raise between 40 and 50 million lira. The bottom line for Mussolini is this: Italy needs 60 million inhabitants rather than the current 40 million. And then, sounding much like Musk, Mussolini says this: all nations and all empires have felt the bite of their decadence when they have seen their birth rates decline. What was the Pax Romana of Augustus? The Pax Romana of Augustus was a brilliant facade, behind which lay the already fermenting signs of decline. And throughout the last century of the Second Republic, from Julius Caesar, who sent his legionaries with 3 sons to the fertile lands of the south, to the laws of Augustus, to the Ordines Maritandi, the anguish is evident. The whole history of Rome up to Trajan, in the last century of the Republic, and from the 1st to the 3rd century of the Empire, is dominated by this anguish. The empire was no longer held because it had to be defended by mercenaries. Now, I'm not by any means drawing a direct link between Valditara's perspective on Roman identity and Mussolini's celebration of Rome. Nevertheless, I do find it interesting how numerous strands in the thinking about ancient Rome of Mussolini, Valditara, and Elon Musk interrelate. In short, it's that promoting national birth rates is a way to protect certain sorts of identities, be they racial or national. Increasing national birth rates is a way to refute certain arguments that encouraging immigration might mitigate against the harms of an aging population. The Christchurch terrorist said it's the birth rates. Except, no, it isn't. It's the racist fear of the other, the terrifying notion that being in the global minority might become too apparent. It's the misogynistic fear of women having autonomy over their own bodies, and it's the transphobic and homophobic fear that love may not always be about biological reproduction. It's the fear that a group who has historically enjoyed positional superiority over all others may be losing its monopoly on power. Thank you very much.